Not to pry, but you sound like you're from the southeast. Do I? Do I? Yeah, I am. There is somebody who has made a response to me.
He's the king of transphobes. If I can debunk him, I could probably debunk anybody.
Like, I would not sign off on that claim of, like, if you can debunk me, then you can debunk anyone, because obviously I'm not suggesting that I'm the least debunkable person. The reason I'm called King Critical is because my channel name used to be King ar-pharazon, which basically came from the fact that I happened to be reading the Silmarillion at the time. Yeah, every now and then I get people who, like, think that the use of the word king is quite magnanimous, but whatever.
And that video is refuting Contra points in 17 minutes.
Okay, that's a fun choice. I think a really good video, like, that I would be interested in hearing somebody respond to is my video, How Gender Identity Lies About Reality. The claim was that this is a video where I make all of my key points. And you'll notice, it's really not. I'm in a position of defending J.K. Rowling. I wouldn't say she's kind of my ideological inspiration or anything like that. It is just wrong to say that this video is like a microcosm of all of my core beliefs. I will say, I don't know that I'm happy with this ContraPoints video. I was kind of trying to do two things which were kind of contradictory. On the one hand, I was trying to make the most efficient, time-efficient debunking of Contra I could, and at the same time, I was trying to get it out as soon as possible. And those two things were at loggerheads. I'm not sure if I'm really happy with the video.
He wasn't just merely comparing the fact that the anti-abortion crowd and the anti-transgender crowd are incrementalists, but was more specifically making the point that the reason why they're incrementalists is because their ideas are currently not palatable to a large amount of the population.
That's true, but I would say that doesn't really affect my point. It's also drawing a parallel in that they're unpopular. But again, my kind of point still stands. I think this is a disingenuous effort by Contra to be like, hey, look, the gender critical movement is just like the anti-abortion movement. Okay, is it just like it because it wants to take away women's bodily autonomy? No. Is it like it in any of the ways that make the anti-abortion movement bad? And the answer is no. It's just like it because they want to achieve their goals incrementally because right now their views aren't popular. Kind of anti-monarchy sentiment in the UK, one of the ways to achieve that is kind of an incrementalism of sorts. Like, I think that, because right now it'll be really unpopular. Is the anti-monarchism movement like the abortion movement? Well, no. So yeah, I don't think that really affected my point.
Contra wasn't making an argument, she was just drawing a comparison between two political movements.
What I was doing there, if you'll notice, is I was kind of making, I guess, the suggestion and the intimation. I think Contra specifically chose a kind of more conservative, anti-progressive movement to draw that association without actually arguing in any way there is actually a substantial similarity between the gender critical movement and the abortion movement. The problem really is the conspiracy theory aspect, which is the problem with all the other positions listed, except for the gender critical position, which isn't a conspiracy theory.
What's conspiratorial about the concept of the friend zone? It just means that a woman sees you too much as a friend to want to...
I mean, I'm giving the W to F-Rominator here, and that, like, yes, okay, I'll agree. Feminazis in the friend zone aren't conspiracies, but like the reason why like people calling like being bigoted against women is bad is not because they believe in the friend zone or because they call women feminazis. It's because they're against progress for women's rights. It's silly to draw superficial parallels to imply movements are the same. Like, if you can't explain why the gender critical movement is bad or harmful, and the only thing you can do is say, well, they support incrementalism, like the anti-abortion movement. They believe in a transgender conspiracy theory, just like homophobes believe in the gay agenda. It's like you're not actually making a criticism of the gender critical movement. That's my problem. Like, even if the gender critical movement does want to engage in incremental strategies because perhaps their beliefs, as stated plainly, might be unpopular in the current political climate, and you could say that's like the anti-abortion movement, but that doesn't make the gender critical movement wrong.
Feeling threatened is the distinctive psychological experience of bigotry, much more so than feeling hateful.
White nationalists could argue that Black Lives Matter is bigoted because they feel threatened. And you know who else feels threatened? Bigots. Now,
Quick question, what's the difference between what King Critical has gotten on to Contra for doing, that being drawing superficial parallels between groups, and King Critical drawing a superficial parallel to what Contra said and something a white supremacist could hypothetically say?
so I was basically, in that context, addressing what I recognize to be a potential conclusion someone could get from ContraPoints' words. If Contra just says out into the ether, feeling threatened is one of the things experienced in bigoted movements, one of the driving motivations in bigoted movements, then it's entirely possible someone watching the video might think, yeah, actually that's interesting, because the lesbian who I told to shut up and suck my girl dick, she seemed pretty threatened, so I guess she must have been a bigot. I think that was ContraPoints' intention, to put that idea in people's heads of, hey, if someone seems threatened by you, it must mean they're a bigot. And I was saying, well, if you carry that logic to its obvious conclusion, you would have to say that actually people who have a legitimate case for feeling threatened would, I guess, also be bigots. Basically make these kind of weird associations where you just sort of allude to other things or allude to potential kind of motivations that might make somebody bigoted or might motivate bigotry, actually talk directly about bigotry as an issue. And that was basically my criticism. Contra doesn't really make the claim the gender critical movement is bigoted because blah, blah, blah. Instead, Contra says, well, they sure do seem threatened. And like I said, I don't think that's a legitimate way to argue.
But even then, Contra never said that feeling threatened makes you a bigot, but that bigots claim to feel threatened. Again, those are two entirely different claims.
It's worth noting, I think it was kind of obvious, the way I was engaging with this video was partially thinking about how ContraPoints might be engaging in manipulative language by drawing these associations, or basically through kind of the art of implication. I think it's clear what ContraPoints is trying to imply is, the gender critical movement sure does seem threatened. With the implication, yes, that they are, by that logic, bigoted.
This is the level of antipathy that I attract from trans Twitter.
But I will say that it's telling that many trans activists have experienced hatred and attacks from other trans activists.
Tell us who they are and what they were afraid of saying.
I think one of the examples that I brought up, which I find really funny, is the fact that Vorsh, literally in his response to J.K. Rowling's article, was like, hey, there's a huge amount of diversity of thought allowed within the trans activist movement. Just the other day I was telling ContraPoints how I thought that the whole uwu thing was annoying. If that's their example of, look at the huge amount of diversity of thought allowed within our movement, it shows you how little diversity of thought is allowed within their movement. But do you know who is actually, yes, afraid of TRAs and the response that they could get? ContraPoints. ContraPoints got cancelled just for saying, sometimes I prefer conservative spaces because I'm less likely to have my pronouns asked. ContraPoints tweeted a hot take like 4 years ago and got driven into hiding. It's that simple. I do just want to say that JK is mostly thinking out loud here. She's wondering if maybe it's possible that growing up as a woman under patriarchy might be a contributing factor to the desire to be a different gender. In case there was anybody who was kind of listening but not watching, while I was talking there, a Wikipedia article or something for just asking questions. Essentially, it's a lot like playing devil's advocate, and it's something that people like to make fun of. Sometimes I wonder if it would solve all the problems if we just flew all of the trans people onto an island and just left them there. I'm not saying that's what we should do, but I just, was wondering if that might solve the problem. If I'm saying that, okay, yeah, you can criticize me for that. That's obviously a pretty objectionable thing to be saying, and it's pretty disingenuous of me to be kind of introducing that idea under the banner of, well, I'm just wondering if it might work. I'm just asking questions. Does it make sense to maybe do that? Of course, a lot of the time, actually exploring ideas is a very valid thing to do. And it's worth noting, of course, that J.K. Rowling isn't saying something horrible here. All J.K. Rowling is saying is, hey, maybe it's possible that internalized misogyny is influencing some of this. Trans identity is something which, no matter where you come from, and no matter which way the research falls, I would say confidently needs more research. This is something where new kind of ways of conceiving of trans identity were coming out within the last few decades. This is not something where we can say, oh, we all know everything about it. It's perfectly legitimate for anybody to say anything. Like, genuinely, somebody could say, hey, is it all the plastic in all the endocrine disruptors? Is that causing people to become trans? And you know what? They're allowed to ask that question because we don't know. And we can't say that we know. We can't say like, oh, no, it definitely isn't. And it's offensive of you to even ask that question. You can't use the whole just asking questions label to dismiss the idea of anybody floating any idea, regardless of how inoffensive it is.
My first questions would be, why is it only happening now, considering essentially every society in all of existence has been patriarchal, and why is it happening in the closest things to egalitarian societies we have today?
Like, obviously, in the most patriarchal society ever, a woman saying, I identify as a man now, guys, so you can't be misogynistic towards me, wouldn't fly. But nowadays, of course, society is less patriarchal and things are more egalitarian. So, yeah, nowadays, there is the option of women identifying out of patriarchy. But in the past, when, like I say, it wasn't presented as an option, you still had many kind of famous examples of women dressing up as men, presenting as men, in order to try and get by and to escape patriarchy. So the thing is, you would have to argue, while there is a history of women pretending to be men to escape patriarchy, and there are now a growing number of biological females saying that they are men, that these two things have nothing to do with each other. And I don't think that's a very kind of credible position to hold to.
Mind you, how much intuitive sense something makes doesn't actually matter. Intuitively, a flat Earth makes more sense than a round Earth.
Okay, so I want to stress this, okay. The first caveman to say, hey, I think the Earth is flat, should have been taken seriously. Because, yeah, the Earth looks pretty flat on a human level, but I'm pretty sure I remember hearing that there was still some problems with Galileo's maths and like his kind of, theories and all that kind of stuff, which weren't ironed out until a little bit afterwards. So the point is, it was still legitimate at that point for people to say, hey, there are still some problems with the heliocentric model. Perhaps we need to, bear in mind that the jury is still out on the geocentric model. That was a perhaps reasonable thing for people to say. When it comes to what ideas is it appropriate to float as a suggestion for people to consider, them being intuitive matters. So the reason they're not worthy of response now is because we have such a mountain of evidence to show that your intuitive, just like first sense of what might be the case, is not correct. You would have to have some kind of hypothetical argument that could show, as concretely as we know that the Earth is a globe and that we know that the sun revolves around the Earth, that we know that trans-identified females aren't doing it because of internalized misogyny. You might not like somebody saying, oh, I think that internalized misogyny could be an explanation for why some biological females identify as trans, but you have to accept the fact that people will speculate about that until there is very obviously no reason to speculate about it.
People transition because of invisible dragons, and it would make just as much sense.
Like, that's where you get back to the intuition thing. Like, if somebody says, hey, maybe, the fact that it kind of sucks to be a woman, and the fact that we have said that somebody can just decide they're not a woman anymore, maybe, possibly, those two things in combination have created an increased number of biological females who have decided they're not going to be women anymore and are going to identify as men instead. That is not only a reasonable thing to speculate based on the fact that you can't prove it wrong, it's also a reasonable thing to speculate based on the fact it kind of makes sense, right? Like, hey, yeah, that does seem like those two things could go together to lead to the... Whereas conversely, of course, there is no reason to, no positive reason to think that there is an invisible pink dragon involved or something like that.
Whereas I feel like transmasculine people are less vilified, but
so infantilized. I'm not really impressed by any argument that appeals to the existence of human agency as a response to people making points about structures of oppression. Yes, well done. Oh, this guy is so smart.
So, women are being systemically oppressed into becoming transgender.
Yeah, well, kind of. I mean, yeah, the point I was making basically, it is a kind of conservative talking point to suggest that personal agency wins out against systemic oppression. Like, it's that simple.
If a woman could leave that power structure, the power structure is essentially meaningless.
Women are being systemically oppressed, and trans identity is a kind of band aid solution that's presenting itself. Women are less able to organize to defend against patriarchal oppression. And the way that's being done is by giving women the false hope of identifying out of womanhood and thus identifying out of patriarchy.
To put it another way, the fact that this can even happen under a patriarchal society is evidence this claim is incorrect.
Okay, so, that's okay. I don't get that. Do you not understand this idea of systems of oppression will often create avenues by which a member of an oppressed group can succeed, but they only succeed by actually upholding the systems of oppression to which they belong, and therefore patriarchy has survived. Like, that allows patriarchy to be sustained.
I mean, if pedantically attempting to define what it meant to be transgender was getting in the way of actually advocating for the rights of transgender people, then yeah, I imagine Contra would be saying essentially the same thing.
Okay, so let's be clear. I mean, really, obviously, the point I'm making here is that to effectively organize for a group's rights, you have to be able to have some kind of coherent concept of what it means to belong to that group. Like, I have never ever been of the position that you need to give a perfect definition. Often the way we use words can be complicated, can be kind of confusing, can even seem contradictory at times, and therefore coming up with a perfect definition is difficult. The point is, you still need to be able to give some kind of definition. When you say you're a woman, what are you actually saying? If you're just saying that you say you're a woman when you say you're a woman, then that doesn't mean anything.
No, it doesn't.
So, okay, so it doesn't matter who's black. Fred Hampton, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, all those people, it didn't matter that they had any concept of who was actually black.
Contra is admitting not only an inability to arrive at a satisfying definition of gender or defense for that definition, but also saying that this is true for the wider trans community.
No, she's just making the point that the wider trans community has various definitions of gender and not all of them agree with each other.
If the trans community as a whole can't come up with any good definition that works, then what are they advocating for? You couldn't do this with other movements. Like, you couldn't have the kind of, black liberation movement where there are a bunch of people thinking that a whole load of kind of Caucasian, northwestern European white people should count as black just because they say so. And it's, of course, a massive joke that ContraPoints is like, trans liberation now. And then it's like, okay, liberation for who? Oh, well, we don't even know. If you ask anybody in the trans movement, you're going to get like 1,000 different answers. No one's going to be able to tell you.
So if you care about having a definition of gender that makes sense and is coherent and can be agreed upon by people,
if you want a simplistic and dogmatic worldview, this is not the side for you.
I mean, it's wild, isn't it? Because when you think about it, okay, what is the first thing you do when you write an academic essay? You establish definitions. Like, if you want to write an essay on why socialism is good, one of the first things you should do is define socialism. And while you might define socialism in a somewhat novel way, you would be writing a bad essay if you started off saying socialism is whatever anybody feels like calling socialism or something like that, like a definition where you're basically not saying anything.
Hell, if you want to play the game of 1984 in language, let me just ask, which one of our sides has very strict definition?
What's the problem with having strict definitions?
Which side, according to this video, remember, has free-flowing and fluid ones that even members of the side cannot quite agree on?
Having definitions that are fluid is actually far more conducive to totalitarianism. In a society where person is fixed and rigid, you can have human rights be properly enforced. But in a society where person is fluid and can change from day to day and person to person, you could have human rights be completely disregarded.
You know, you'd think the trans rights movement would start by bullying women out of calling them men, considering that's the central tenet of transphobia, but I guess not.
I'm not really sure what that last point is supposed to be saying, because the trans movement does bully women into calling trans-identified males women.
More like George Bush did to the National Guard.
Can you do a video debunking pansexual, lol? Yeah, here's my video debunking it. Pans are not sexy. I saw this video which was apparently explaining how the trans movement is Marxist. And this is from James Lindsay. So I was like, you know what? I'm always down for some infighting.
Commie as fuck. That's what it's like in Twitter.
And I mean, that's like, I don't know, that's really dumb, because like, what is like the most popular view on Twitter? It's not communism, it's boring liberalism, like American kind of style liberalism, which is just such a weird mindset to hear something like, oh yeah, you know, Twitter, the place where like, you know, you got all of the blue ticks talking about how you're an evil sexist if you vote for Bernie Sanders, and you've got to vote for Hillary Clinton instead. Oh yeah, that's the place where everybody's communist. Yeah, so I feel like the two main points we've established right now that are really important is, one, no, Twitter isn't the vanguard of the coming communist revolution. It's filled with a bunch of lame liberals. And two, this guy has a bad mouth, or more specifically, bad lips. Very bird-like, I would say.
You could call it a religion or a theology if you wanted.
Ironically, actually, kind of, it's a bit of a postmodern take to say you could call it a religion, because like I say, it's kind of like, well, now you're the one arguing for radically redefining things and whatever.
Description of the world is that there are certain people in power. They get to designate the terms of society. So they create forms of property that they give themselves access to and exclude other people from in order to maintain their power.
A Marxist would say that the existing economic kind of circumstances are what determined how society would be organized. Whereas if you just say, well, there's these people in charge and they've used property to get themselves loads of stuff, you're implying that like I say, the economic circumstances have extended from the motivations of some kind of pre-existent upper class or elite.
And this is something you can awaken to as the nature of how society works. So what is a person? A person is somebody who can be awakened to this fact.
Literally, you could add that to the description of anything. Like I could say, oh yeah, there are these people who believe that the earth is a globe. Like, yeah, they think the earth is a globe and they believe this is something you can be awakened to. And it's like, well, technically that's true. Most people who believe the earth is a globe probably do believe that assuming awaken just means come to realize this is a thing you can come to realize, but using that language of like you get awakened to it makes it sound needlessly kind of religious and spiritual when it of course isn't.
Changing it into what it should have been, which is without that particular power dynamic that structures society.
The implication of saying should have been is to imply that we should have gone straight from, you know, I don't know, like what, caveman times immediately into communism or I guess socialism. And of course that's not what Marxists believe. Marxists, yeah, would generally tend to say that actually pretty much the way that different property systems developed was pretty much necessary, and therefore there's no like, oh no, we should have skipped straight to communism. So yeah, slight inaccuracy there, whatever.
And in fact, communism needs to be the positive transcendence. This is what he actually wrote. The positive transcendence of private property and thus human self-estrangement, which is a very kind of religious concept.
It's basically just saying you can change your mindset and become a happier person, and that on a kind of more macro level, society could change its culture so that we could, you know, become happier, healthier people mentally. If you have a political system that does not center the idea of some kind of fundamental change in the way that human beings view themselves and how society encourages human beings to view themselves, then I feel like you're probably not appreciating just how messed up the kind of, I guess, psychology of society as a collective is right now.
Communists will actually tell you it's not in there. It's in there a bunch of times, but it's very explicit in the second chapter. Marx says that communism can be summarized in a single sentence, which is the abolition of private property.
What communists has this guy been talking to who deny that communism is about abolishing private property?
Would you call it like a modern form of Marxism or
Postmodern form, actually, but yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so you notice that postmodern? I feel like I have to say this every single time. Postmodern and Marxist are literally diametrically opposed. Marxism is very much about this idea of there being a very kind of objective truth to our analysis of society. And postmodernism is the opposite of that. Postmodernism is the idea of, well, who's to say anything's true?
And so everybody like me is normal. So we're the normal people. And then outside of that realm, there are people who are not normal or abnormal, and we'll call them queer.
It's so weird because essentially what this guy is saying, I guess, is, well, Marxism led to trans identity because, and this is the logic presented, Marxism is against property. But what if, and that what if, you need to imagine it like having the biggest muscles in the world because it's going to be carrying a lot here. What if you said that actually being normal is, or being able to consider yourself normal is like property? Therefore, the very idea, I assume, is where we're going. The idea of being able to consider yourself normal is therefore something that also needs to be abolished. So we need to abolish the entire idea of being able to think of anything as normal or standard or whatever else. And therefore we need to question everything and question every kind of social categorization and blah, 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 is, I assume, where we're going. But like, it can also go the other way, right? Like, capitalism is all about buying and selling property. So you could say, whoa, what if we said property is being able to consider yourself normal, and therefore you should just be able to buy social categorizations? It's not like, here is why it would make sense, or here is how the logic of Marxism could lead to affirming trans identity. It's just saying, well, what if you decided to understand a particular part of Marxism in a wildly unconventional way? And it's like, well, yeah, I guess that would probably lead to some curious results.
In my state, in Tennessee, I don't know, I was told a long time ago that I can't shoot you if you threaten me, but if you try to steal anything from me, I can shoot you dead.
Right.
So yeah, you're allowed to protect your private property with rather extreme force.
Oh, so, okay, what if, okay, hear me out here, you're allowed to protect your private property with extreme force, so what if you just said that actually, being considered normal is a part of property, because after all, apparently that's a thing we can just say now, like, what if that was true? Well, suddenly, if someone suggests that you're not normal, or somebody, if somebody's being heteronormative around you, you're allowed to shoot them. Because that's how it works in Tennessee, right? So yeah, there we go. You can see the issue with just throwing out this random what if. The video is called "The Problem of Capitalism," and we'll see whether or not ContraPoints does a good job on disputing. Yeah, on something where it's not a trans ID thing.
The Red Lobster, PetSmart, Chipotle.
You know what I find crazy about Red Lobster? Like, isn't lobster supposed to be like this really expensive luxury food? So I just find it weird when Americans are just like, oh yeah, Red Lobster. And it's like, what's happening where you have like, that's like being like, oh yeah, we're going to, like, oh, there's a local Joe's Caviar down the street. Like, how is that a chain restaurant? How have you got a chain restaurant just for lobster?
Political dissent begins with the vaguest feeling that something is wrong.
To be fair, wouldn't it be a bit wild if political dissent started with the idea that everything was fine?
Capitalism did. So what you need to do...
Oh my god, I literally forgot this video was about capitalism. Like, that just doesn't that just sum up BreadTube for you right there?
Much of Karl Marx's early writings are primarily concerned with the state of the human soul under capitalism.
This pairs well with the video I already did. I will be interested to see, because I don't care about defending capitalism, but like, obviously a classic point that is made is that, there is a risk taken on by somebody who's going to build an entire factory. I do see people present that as like a moral justification for the idea of capitalist ownership. I mean, the pretty obvious facts that, well, they're taking a big risk.
Then I take my Vitalamax Plus and I'm ready to rip it open.
Like, the funny thing is, when Alex Jones is doing it, kind of like, okay, like, doesn't he like make shows? Like, isn't he like making a show every single day? So it's kind of like, yeah, I guess maybe he does have a big brain. Maybe he does need the brain force. But it's like ContraPoints, meanwhile, being like, hey, I take these pills and they help me get my work done. And it's like, oh, wow, really? So you're telling me that if I took those pills, I could produce an 1.5-hour video every 9 months? Of course, I mean, the funny thing is, sorry, someone pointed out YouTube grift isn't capitalism or whatever. Yeah, a lot of YouTubers pay people to write their scripts and all that kind of stuff. So basically, they're literally like, that's like they're using their platform as a means to generate money and then paying people to do a lot of the actual labor. Yeah, it's definitely true that a lot of these people could be accused of not actually doing a lot of the work themselves, which of course would make them like, not really the workers.
And you spend your day dealing with whiny, entitled white bitches who don't understand that you're just a lackey.
I don't really approve of use of the B word.
No, please don't transfer me to the billing department. They already transferred me.
Do you want to hear a story about the most annoying conversation I had with customer service? So this is the conversation I had, right? So, they asked me all this stuff. They asked me, what's your name? I say, King Critical. They say, no, it's not. And then they kick me off. No, that's not true. They say, okay, what's your security question? And I was like, are you asking me what the question itself is? She basically just repeated it again. She was like, well, I need to know what your security question is. I was like, okay, I'm just going to have to fucking lean into this and explain to this person who is apparently in charge of checking my details how a security question is supposed to work. So, like, you would ask me, what is the first school I went to? And then I would know that because I'm me. Or if you ask me what my first cat is, or sorry, what my first pet was, I would know the answer to that because I'm me. But what I'm not gonna know is what the question itself was decades ago when I set this up. That's not how security questions work. Also, the last time I called a like customer service thing, it was a Scouse. And I like just was like, okay, I'm just gonna have to get this conversation done as efficiently as possible because I don't know. All right, this what I'm gonna have to do is ask you all about your details, like that. And I was just like, okay. Joe Rogan suggested we just shoot the homeless, that sort of thing. Okay, here's the counterpoint. So one time I saw a Joe Rogan video where he actually made a really good point. Trophy hunting is a net positive for conservation because the money gained from trophy hunting can be used to kind of stop poaching and to basically actually help the animals. So trophy hunting is potentially a very big part of sustainable and continually economically viable conservation efforts for some of the most endangered animals out there. Anyway, the point is, you could apply the same logic to the homeless, right? So, so you could make sure we continue to have homeless people for generations to come, generations in the future to enjoy. So again, it's kind of like there's that thing of like, you do have these kind of nuanced policies you need to consider. Like, I would say this, okay? If someone, like, you talk about trophy hunting, if someone wanted to like get a dagger and just go 1-to-1 with a shark in the water, maybe like, okay, so the shark has a big advantage because they're like kind of accustomed to it. So maybe give them flippers and maybe even like some kind of armor, so like the shark can kind of have a chance to get a few shots in there without the person just dying immediately. So like, give the person a bit of an advantage, but like just person 1-to-1 a shark, or maybe even like more than one person. That would be awesome. Isn't it funny that like the thumbnail is of Megan Murphy, and there's a secret ContraPoints response here. I'm not going to even let anyone know. Screw the views. I think it'll be funny to not let people know.